The fluorescent lights in the bakery kitchen had a way of making everything look slightly sick. The walls, the steel counters, the pale dough rising in rows of greased pans, all of it bathed in that greenish-white glow that turned even the healthiest person into something that belonged in a hospital ward. Solene Mbire had been standing under those lights since 3 in the morning, and now, at 2:30 in the afternoon, she could feel them in her bones, humming like a frequency her body had learned to absorb instead of resist. Her hands were dusted with flour up to the wrists, and there was a smear of chocolate ganache on her left forearm that she hadn't noticed for at least an hour. Her lower back had moved past aching into a kind of dull resignation, the muscles simply accepting that this was their life now. Bent slightly forward, weight shifting from one foot to the other, repeating the same precise motion she had repeated 6,000 times before. Roll, fold, press. Roll, fold, press. The croissant dough didn't care that she was exhausted. It demanded consistency, and Solène gave it what it demanded because that was what she did. She gave and gave and gave until there was nothing left, and then she found a way to give a little more. The bakery was called Marigold. She had taken over the lease 18 months ago from a retired Greek couple who handed her the keys with a mixture of relief and pity she pretended not to notice. The neighborhood in Briarfield, a working-class stretch on the south side, hadn't exactly welcomed a young black woman selling French pastries and West African-inspired breads. But Solène had learned a long time ago that the world rarely rolled out anything for people like her, so she had made her own welcome, one perfectly laminated croissant at a time. The shop had regulars now. Mr. Petrosian, who came every morning at 6:15 for his pain au chocolat and never said more than 3 words but always left $1 in the tip jar. The group of construction workers from the site down the block who ordered meat pies by the dozen every Friday and called her chef with a respect that made her stand a little taller. Mrs. Oduya from the apartment above, who brought her own tea and sat by the window for hours, reading romance novels and occasionally offering unsolicited but surprisingly accurate opinions about Solène's love life, which was non-existent, completely, aggressively, almost impressively non-existent. Not by choice, exactly, but not entirely by accident either. Solène had loved once, deeply and stupidly, and it had ended the way cheap fireworks end. A lot of noise, a brief flash of something that looked like it might be spectacular, and then nothing but smoke, and the smell of something burning. His name was Kendrick Ayoade, and she had spent 3 years of her life building a future with a man who was simultaneously building a future with 2 other women. The discovery had been public, humiliating, and thorough. A revelation that didn't just break your heart, but rearranged your understanding of your own judgment. That was 4 years ago. She had moved cities, changed careers, traded a promising position at a corporate catering company for the terrifying freedom of her own shop. She had rebuilt herself from the foundation up, and she was proud of what she had become. But there was a hollow place inside her chest that she had learned to walk around rather than through. A room in her heart with a locked door she didn't have the energy to open. Tonight, like every night, she would close the shop at 5, scrub the counters, count the register, and walk the 7 blocks home to her apartment above a laundromat. She would eat leftover soup standing at the counter because sitting down felt like giving in to the tiredness. She would shower, set her alarm for 2:45, and fall asleep before her head settled into the pillow. It was a life. Not glamorous, not exciting, but hers. Every square inch of it earned and owned and defended. And most days that was enough to keep the loneliness at bay. Most days. Thursday evening arrived with a cold that had teeth. November in Briarfield meant wind that came off the river like it had a personal grudge, slicing through jackets and scarves, and any illusion that layering was enough. Selene locked the bakery door with fingers that had gone numb 10 minutes ago, her breath forming small clouds that disappeared before they had a chance to mean anything. She was carrying two things: a canvas tote bag full of day-old bread she was dropping at the shelter on Ninth Street, and a headache that had started behind her eyes and was slowly colonizing her entire skull. She had forgotten to eat lunch again, the third time this week, and her body was making its displeasure known through a symphony of complaints that she had become disturbingly good at ignoring. The shelter was 6 blocks east, and she walked quickly, head down against the wind, her mind cycling through tomorrow's prep list. 200 dinner rolls for a catering order. The sourdough starters needed feeding. She was almost out of cardamom. She turned the corner onto Ninth and nearly collided with a wall of black fabric. Not a wall, a man. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a coat that looked like it cost more than her monthly rent. He was standing in the middle of the sidewalk like he owned it, or more accurately, like the concept of sidewalk ownership had never occurred to him because he owned everything around it too. "Sorry," Selene muttered, sidestepping without looking up. "Wasn't watching where I was going." She made it exactly 3 steps past him before her tote bag, overstuffed and under-reinforced, chose that precise moment to surrender. The bottom seam gave way with a soft ripping sound, and 12 loaves of bread tumbled onto the frozen sidewalk in a cascade of sourdough and whole wheat that scattered in every direction. No, 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 no. She dropped to her knees immediately, scrambling to gather the loaves before they rolled into the gutter or got trampled. The cold concrete bit through her jeans, and her headache spiked with the sudden movement. This was fine. Everything was fine. She just needed to. A hand appeared in her field of vision. Long fingers, clean nails, a watch on the wrist that caught the streetlight and threw it back in fragments. The hand was holding a loaf of her sourdough, offering it to her the way someone might offer a fallen crown back to a queen. She looked up. The man she had nearly walked into was crouching beside her, his expression unreadable in the half-light of the street. He was Korean, with a face that belonged on a magazine cover, the sort that came shrink-wrapped and cost $40. Sharp jaw, dark eyes that seemed to process everything at once. Hair pushed back in a way that looked effortless, but probably wasn't. He was beautiful in the way that expensive things are beautiful. Precisely, intentionally, and with a faint suggestion that touching was not permitted. "You make these?" he asked, and his voice was low and unhurried, like a man who had never been rushed in his life and saw no reason to start now. "Yes," Selene said, taking the loaf from his hand and trying to ignore the fact that his fingers were warm against hers in the freezing air. "They're for the shelter on Ninth." Something shifted in his expression. A flicker she couldn't name, gone before she could catch it. He picked up another loaf, and then another, gathering them with a care that seemed disproportionate to the task. Like the bread mattered. Like she mattered. "Then we should make sure they get there," he said. She should have refused the help. But her bag was destroyed, her arms were full, and this stranger was already holding half her bread with an expression that suggested he intended to see this through, whether she liked it or not. They walked the remaining 3 blocks in near silence, Selene stealing glances at the man beside her. Rich men in expensive coats did not walk Briarfield at 7 on a Thursday night. They did not crouch on frozen sidewalks to pick up bread for strangers. At the shelter door, she turned to thank him, but he was already handing the last loaves to a volunteer, speaking in a voice too low for her to hear. When he straightened and met her eyes again, there was something in his gaze that made her stomach drop. Not fear, not attraction, but recognition. Like he had been looking for something without knowing what it was, and had just found it in the last place he expected. "Your bread is extraordinary," he said, and before she could respond, he turned and walked back the way they had come, disappearing into the cold like the night had simply opened its mouth and swallowed him whole. Solène stood in the shelter doorway for a long moment, her empty hands tingling where the bread had been, her mind trying to file what had just happened into a category that made sense. It wouldn't fit anywhere. The man who had carried Solène Mbire's bread through the frozen streets of Briarfield was not the kind of person who carried things. He was the kind of person things were carried for. His name was Dae Seong Kwan, and he controlled more of this city than the mayor, the police commissioner, and the three largest real estate developers combined, though none of those people would ever admit it publicly, and two of them would deny knowing his name even under oath. He was the head of the Kwan Syndicate, an organization that had its roots in the docklands of Incheon and its branches in every major port city across the Pacific Rim. By the age of 32, he had consolidated operations that his father had spent a lifetime building and his grandfather had spent a lifetime before that dreaming about. By 35, he had expanded into territories that neither of them would have dared approach. Now, at 38, he sat at the center of a web so vast and intricate that pulling any single thread would unravel institutions that ordinary people assumed were permanent. He was not a man who crouched on sidewalks. He was not a man who helped strangers. And he was categorically, absolutely, not a man who walked 6 blocks through a freezing November night to deliver bread to a homeless shelter because a woman with flour on her wrists had looked at him like he was just a person. And yet, in the back seat of the black Genesis sedan that had been trailing him at a discreet distance, because Dae Seong Kwan walked when and where he pleased, but his security chief, Yoon Ho, was not the kind of man who left anything to chance. He sat in silence, turning the encounter over in his mind like a jeweler examining a stone for flaws. Yoon-ho watched him in the rearview mirror with the carefully neutral expression of a man who had learned, over 15 years of service, that his employer's silences were more dangerous than most men's threats. "The woman," Yoon-ho said cautiously, his Korean measured and respectful. "Should I have her looked into?" "No," Dae-seong said. And then, after a pause that lasted long enough to make Yoon-ho's hands tighten on the steering wheel, "Yes." "Which is it, sir?" "Find out who she is. Nothing invasive. Just the basics." Yoon-ho nodded, filing the contradiction away without comment. In 15 years, he had never seen Dae-seong pick something up off the ground. He had once watched his employer step over a briefcase containing $400,000 in cash because bending down was someone else's job. And tonight, this man had knelt on a frozen sidewalk to retrieve bread from a gutter. Dae-seong stared out the tinted window at the passing streets, but he wasn't seeing them. He was seeing her hands, the way they moved with a precision that spoke of years of practice, fast and sure and utterly unself-conscious, the flour on her skin, the smear of chocolate she didn't know was there, the way she had looked at him without a single trace of recognition or fear, just mild annoyance at having her path blocked, followed by the kind of pragmatic acceptance that said, "Fine, you're here. Make yourself useful." When was the last time someone had looked at him like that? When was the last time someone had treated him like an obstacle to be navigated rather than a force to be appeased? He genuinely could not remember. The report Yoon-ho placed on his desk the following morning was slim. A single page. Solène Mbire, 29, born in Baltimore, daughter of Cameroonian immigrants. Culinary degree. 1 failed catering business. 1 relationship ended badly. A man named Kendrick Iowad. Current occupation, owner of Marigold Bakery on Voss Street. Annual revenue, barely enough to keep the lights on. No criminal record, no debts beyond the lease, no connections to anyone in his world. She was, by every metric his organization used to evaluate people, insignificant. And yet, he had carried her bread. And yet, he was reading her file at 7 in the morning with a cup of coffee going cold beside him. Dae Seong Kwan had not become who he was by ignoring instincts. His father had taught him many things. How to read a room, how to identify weakness, how to turn an enemy into an asset or a corpse, depending on which was more efficient. But the most important lesson had been the simplest. When something pulls at you, pay attention. The universe does not repeat its invitations. He set the report down and looked out the window at a city that belonged to him in ways most of its inhabitants would never understand. Somewhere out there, a woman was pulling croissants out of an oven, unaware that the man who had picked up her bread was sitting in a penthouse 30 stories above the skyline, thinking about the way flour looked against dark skin. He picked up his phone and dialed Yun Ho. "The bakery on Voss Street," he said. "I want to know everything. The lease terms, the supplier contracts, the foot traffic patterns, everything." A pause on the other end. "Sir, is this a business interest or—" "Everything, Yun Ho." The line went dead, and Daeshang leaned back in his chair, a ghost of something crossing his face that Yun Ho, had he been present, would not have recognized. It was the beginning of a smile. Selene did not expect to see the man again. Briarfield was the kind of neighborhood where strangers passed through but rarely stayed, and everything about him, the coat, the watch, the way he moved like the air itself made room for him, screamed that he belonged somewhere else entirely. Somewhere with valet parking and marble countertops, and people who didn't carry bread in canvas bags that fell apart at the seams. So when the bell above her bakery door chimed at 6:45 the following Monday morning, and she looked up from the register to find him standing in her shop like he had materialized out of thin air, her first thought was that she was hallucinating. Her second thought was that her hallucinations had excellent taste in coats. He was alone this time, or appeared to be, though she would later learn that the black sedan parked across the street contained a man with a gun and a very specific set of instructions regarding her safety that she had not requested and did not yet know about. "You're open early," he said, as though this were a perfectly normal visit and he were a perfectly normal customer. "I'm a bakery," Solène replied, her hands still frozen on the register keys. "We open early. That's sort of the whole thing." He looked around the shop, the mismatched chairs, the chalkboard menu, the glass case full of croissants and pain au chocolat, and the chin-chin cookies her mother had taught her to make when she was 9 years old. And his expression shifted into something she couldn't decode. Not judgment. Something closer to respect. "I would like to try everything," he said. Solène blinked. "Everything?" "Everything in the case. One of each." There are 23 items in the case." "Then I would like 23 items." He said it the way someone might say they'd like a glass of water, simply, without emphasis, as though the request were so reasonable it barely warranted discussion. She stared at him for a moment, trying to decide if he was serious or insane or both, and then she did what she always did when the world stopped making sense. She went to work. She pulled out a stack of boxes and began filling them methodically, each pastry placed with the care she gave everything that left her kitchen. He watched her hands as she worked, and she felt his attention like a physical thing, warm and focused and entirely too intimate for 7 o'clock on a Monday morning between two people who had exchanged a combined total of maybe 30 words. "You didn't tell me your name," she said, not looking up from the box she was filling. "The other night, you carried my bread 6 blocks and then disappeared like some kind of well-dressed ghost." "Quan Daesiong," he said. "Most people call me Mr. Quan. You may call me Daesiong if you prefer." "Most people call you Mr. Quan," she repeated, glancing up with an eyebrow raised. "What are you, a CEO or something?" "Or something," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved in a way that suggested he found the question more amusing than she intended. "Well, Mr. or something, that'll be $87.40. She slid the boxes across the counter. Her pastries weren't cheap. They couldn't be, not with the butter she imported and the hours she invested. Daesong produced $100 bill from his pocket like it had been waiting there specifically for this moment. Keep the change. I don't need your. It's not charity, he said, and something in his voice shifted, a weight settling behind the words that hadn't been there before. It's recognition. You charge what you charge because your work is worth what you charge. I'm simply agreeing with your assessment. Solène opened her mouth to argue, because arguing was her default setting. But the words died somewhere between her brain and her lips, killed by the sincerity she saw in his face. He wasn't performing generosity. He wasn't angling for anything. He was stating a fact. Without pride, without expectation. Just truth. Thank you, she said finally, and the words came out softer than she intended. He picked up the boxes, all 4 of them, stacked with a precision that suggested he had done manual labor at some point in his life, even if that point was several tax brackets ago, and turned toward the door. Then he stopped, half-turned, and looked at her over his shoulder. The chin-chin, he said. The small fried cookies in the corner of the case. What are they? They're Nigerian. Well, originally, my mother is Cameroonian, but her mother learned the recipe from a neighbor in Douala. I changed the spice blend, added cardamom and a little black pepper. She was talking too much, she realized, rambling the way she did when she was nervous, filling silence with words because silence left room for things she didn't want to feel. They're my grandmother's recipe. Sort of. They're the best thing in this shop, Daesong said. And everything in this shop is exceptional. Then he walked out, and the bell above the door chimed behind him like a period at the end of a sentence she wasn't ready to finish. Solène stood behind her counter for a long time after he left, the $100 bill still in her hand, her heart doing something complicated in her chest that she refused to examine too closely. Mr. Petrosian, who had arrived at 6:15 as always, and witnessed the entire exchange from his corner table without comment, caught her eye on his way out and gave her the smallest nod, the most expressive gesture she had ever seen from him. And Solène served the next customer with a smile that felt slightly different than usual, though she couldn't have explained how or why if her life depended on it. She told herself it didn't matter. A rich man had bought some pastries. That was all. It meant nothing. He would not come back, and she would not think about the way his voice sounded when he said the word exceptional. And she would certainly not replay the moment his fingers had brushed hers, when he took the bread from her hands on that frozen sidewalk 5 days ago. She told herself all of this with great conviction, and she didn't believe a single word. He came back on Wednesday, then Friday, then every day the following week. He stopped coming on a Thursday. No warning, no explanation. The bell above the door chimed at 6:15 for Mr. Petrosian, then at 7 for the construction crew, then at 8:30 for Mrs. Oduya and her romance novel and her unsolicited commentary. But no Daesong, no black coat filling the doorway at 6:45, no quiet voice ordering one of everything. Solène told herself she didn't notice. She told herself it didn't matter, that she had managed perfectly well before a stranger started buying 23 pastries every morning, and she would manage perfectly well now that he had stopped. She was not the kind of woman who arranged her emotions around the presence or absence of a man. She had learned that lesson the hard way, and the tuition had been her entire sense of self-worth. She would not pay it again. But her hands kept drifting to the chin-chin as she arranged the case each morning, placing them in the corner where he always looked first, and she caught herself listening for the bell with an anticipation that made her furious at herself. 3 weeks he had been coming. 3 weeks of 23 pastries and conversations that started with bread and ended somewhere much more dangerous. Childhood memories traded across the counter like secrets. Quiet observations about the neighborhood that revealed a mind far more perceptive than his reserved manner suggested. And once, just once, a laugh. A real laugh, sudden and unguarded, that had transformed his face so completely she had almost dropped the tray she was holding. 3 weeks, and then nothing. She spent the first week pretending it was fine, the second week being angry about it, the third week being angry at herself for being angry about it. By the end of that third week, she had settled into a grim resignation that felt disturbingly familiar, the same emotional armor she had strapped on after Kendrick, the same practiced indifference she wore like a second skin. You knew better, she told herself as she scrubbed the counters that night with more force than the dried flour deserved. You knew better than to let someone in, and you did it anyway. And now look at you, mourning a man you barely knew because he bought your pastries and told you your chin-chin was exceptional. She locked the bakery door, walked her 7 blocks home, ate her soup standing up, and went to bed. And if her pillow was damp in the morning, that was between her and the pillow, and neither of them would ever speak of it. On the 22nd day, a delivery truck she hadn't ordered pulled up outside Marigold at noon. The driver carried in 12 cases of Normandy butter, the good butter, the imported butter, the butter she had been rationing for months because her supplier had raised prices and her margins were already thinner than phyllo dough. There was no invoice, no return address, and no explanation. Just a small card tucked between 2 cases in handwriting she had never seen, but somehow recognized. It said, "I had to go. I will come back. Your butter situation was unacceptable." Selene read the card 3 times, standing in the middle of her kitchen surrounded by more butter than she had seen in one place in her entire life, and did something she hadn't done in a very long time. She laughed. He came back on a Sunday, 3 weeks after the butter, 6 weeks after the last time she had seen his face. Selene was not at the bakery. She was sitting on the bench outside Grover Park, the one with the broken slat that she kept meaning to report, but never did. Eating a sandwich she had made from leftovers and watching the last of the autumn leaves surrender to gravity. It was her one day off, and she guarded it the way small nations guard their borders. Fiercely, irrationally, and with a willingness to escalate that most people found disproportionate. The black sedan pulled up to the curb so quietly she didn't hear it over the sound of her own chewing. The back door opened, and Dae-seong stepped out looking like a man who had aged a year in 6 weeks. There were shadows under his eyes she hadn't seen before, and a tension in his jaw that spoke of clenched teeth and sleepless nights. He was wearing a dark sweater instead of the coat. More casual, less armor, and the effect was disarming in a way she hadn't prepared for. "You found me," she said, not a question. Her sandwich was halfway to her mouth, and she made a deliberate decision not to lower it. She would not rearrange herself for his arrival. She would not perform surprise or delight, or any of the things she was actually feeling. "Yunho found you," Dae-seong corrected, sitting down on the bench beside her as though he had been invited. The broken slat creaked under his weight. "I merely asked him to look." "And how did Yunho know where I spend my Sundays?" A pause. The kind of pause that contained information he was deciding whether to share. "I have resources," he said carefully. "Resources." She took a bite of her sandwich, chewed and swallowed. "You mean you had someone follow me?" "I would characterize it differently." "I'm sure you would." She looked at him then, really looked, and saw something she hadn't expected. Uncertainty. This man who bought 23 pastries without blinking, who sent 12 cases of imported butter with a note that made her laugh. He was nervous. Selene had spent 3 weeks watching his face across her counter, learning its microscopic shifts the way she had learned to read dough, by touch, by instinct. He was nervous because he didn't know if she would tell him to leave. "Where did you go?" she asked, and she let some of the hardness drop from her voice. Not all of it. She wasn't ready for that. But enough. "Seoul. Family business that required my presence." He paused again. "It was not optional, and it was not something I could explain in a note." You could have tried. Going to Seoul, be back in 6 weeks. Here's some butter, would have been a start. The ghost of a smile. In my experience, the less I put in writing, the better. That's not ominous at all. No, he agreed. I suppose it isn't. He turned to face her, and the full weight of his attention settled on her like a hand on her shoulder, firm, warm, impossible to ignore. Solène, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear all of it before you respond. She set her sandwich down. The seriousness in his voice had shifted the air between them, replacing the tentative warmth with something charged and precarious. I'm listening. The business I run is not entirely legal. He said it without flinching, without hedging, without any of the verbal gymnastics she might have expected. Just the fact, laid out on the bench between them like a card turned face up. I am the head of an organization that operates in areas most people would find objectionable. I have done things that would make you reconsider every kind thought you have ever had about me. And the reason I left without explanation is because a situation arose that required me to make decisions I did not want you to see me making. Solène sat very still, her sandwich forgotten. She should have been shocked. But the truth was, she had known. Not the specifics, but she had known that a man who walked Briarfield in a coat that cost more than her rent, trailed by a sedan with tinted windows, was not selling insurance. Why are you telling me this? She asked, and her voice was steady, which surprised them both. Because I am going to ask you something. And I refuse to ask it with a lie standing between us. He held her gaze with an intensity that made her stomach drop. I want to see you. Not as a customer, not as a man who buys your pastries and disappears. I want to know you, Solène, and I want you to know me. The real me, not the version I've been showing you across your counter. The real you, she repeated slowly. The one who does things that would make me reconsider every kind thought I've had. Yes. And you think telling me you're a criminal is going to make me want to have dinner with you? I think telling you the truth is the only foundation worth building on. Whatever you decide after that is your decision to make. He paused, and she saw his hands tighten slightly on his knees, the only visible sign of the tension coiled inside him. I have spent my entire life surrounded by people who only see what I can do for them or what I can do to them. You are the first person in longer than I can remember who looked at me and saw neither. I am not willing to let that go without at least asking if you feel the same. The wind picked up, sending dead leaves spiraling across the path. She thought about Kendrick, about the lies she hadn't seen coming. She thought about her mother, who would be horrified. She thought about Mrs. Oduya, who would probably be delighted. And she thought about the way he had crouched on that frozen sidewalk, picking up her bread one loaf at a time. I have conditions, she said. Daesong blinked. The first uncontrolled reaction she had ever seen from him. Conditions. If we do this, and I haven't decided if we're doing this, but if we do, there are rules. You don't lie to me. Ever. Not about the big things, not about the small things, not about anything. I have been lied to by an expert, and I will know, and I will walk, and I will not look back. Agreed. I'm not finished. You don't bring your work to my bakery. Whatever you do out there, it stays out there. Marigold is mine, and it stays clean. No associates, no meetings, no anything that could put my staff or my customers in danger. You don't have staff. I'm planning to hire. Don't change the subject. The faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth. This one slightly wider. Agreed. And one more thing. She turned to face him fully, her brown eyes meeting his dark ones with a directness that left no room for misunderstanding. You disappear on me again without a word, and we're done. I don't care what the reason is. I don't care if Seoul is on fire. You find a way to tell me, even if it's 3 words on a butter delivery. Are we clear? Crystal, Daeseong said, and then, quieter. Does this mean you're saying yes? Selene picked up her sandwich and took a deliberate bite while he waited with a patience that was clearly costing him. She swallowed and looked at him with an expression that was equal parts exasperation and warmth. It means I'm saying I'll think about it while I finish my lunch. You can sit there and be quiet. Daeseong Kwon, who had negotiated with arms dealers and stared down assassins, sat on a broken bench in Grover Park and waited in silence while a baker ate a sandwich. And he did not mind at all. She said yes on a Tuesday. Not with words? Selene had never been the kind of woman who surrendered with language. But with a plate of chin-chin left on the counter when he walked in at 6:45, separate from the case, wrapped in wax paper with his name written on it in her slanting, flour-dusted handwriting, Daeseong picked it up without comment. But Yoon-ho, watching from the sedan across the street, later reported that his employer had held the package against his chest for the duration of the drive to his office, which was behavior so far outside the established parameters of normalcy that Yoon-ho seriously considered calling a physician. Their courtship, Solène preferred the term ongoing investigation into mutual insanity, unfolded in the margins of their separate lives. Dinners in private rooms where the menus had no prices. Walks through parts of the city she had never explored. Late-night phone calls that started with, "Are you still awake?" and ended 3 hours later with neither of them willing to hang up first. He was careful with her. He introduced her to his world in measured doses. A dinner with an associate here, a passing mention of an operation there. Always watching her face for the flinch, the recoil, the moment when the reality of who he was would outweigh whatever she felt for the man underneath. 4 months in, he took her to his home. Not the penthouse she had imagined, but a converted warehouse near the river. 3 stories of exposed brick, warm wood, and more books than she had ever seen outside a library. The kitchen alone made her professional baker's heart stutter with envy. "You cook?" she asked, running her fingers along a copper pot that hung from a ceiling rack like a museum piece. "My mother taught me," he said, and his voice dropped half a register when he said the word mother. A softening, a crack in the armor so brief she would have missed it if she hadn't been learning to read him the way she read dough. By feel, by patience, by knowing when to push and when to wait. Before she died, she made me promise 2 things. Never eat food I haven't tasted first, and never trust anyone who won't sit down and share a meal. Smart woman. The smartest person I have ever known. She would have liked you. He paused, then added with a gravity that caught her off guard. She would have understood you. It was the most personal thing he had ever said to her, and Selene felt it land somewhere deep in her chest, in that locked room she had been walking around for 4 years. The door didn't open, not yet. But she felt it shudder, felt the hinges loosen the smallest fraction. That night, they cooked together for the first time. He made jjigae, a rich, spicy stew that filled the warehouse with steam and warmth. She made puff puff, West African fried dough dusted with powdered sugar that got on everything, including Daeseong's sweater, his chin, and the tip of his nose. He didn't wipe it off. He stood in his kitchen with sugar on his face and looked at her with an expression that would have brought his enemies to their knees if they could have seen it, because it revealed the one thing Daeseong Kwon had spent his entire life concealing. He was capable of joy. "I need to tell you something," he said quietly. Selene's hand stilled on the dough. "If this is where you tell me you have a wife and soul, I don't have a wife." He hesitated. "But I have enemies, people who look for weaknesses to exploit. And you." He met her eyes. "You are becoming a weakness men in my position cannot afford." The words should have frightened her. They were, objectively, a statement that preceded very bad things in movies and in life. But Selena heard something underneath. Not a warning, but a confession. He wasn't telling her she was his weakness. He was telling her she was his weakness, and he had chosen to keep her anyway. "I'm not a weakness," she said firmly. "I'm a baker. And if your enemies have a problem with that, they can take it up with my rolling pin." Daeshong stared at her for a full 3 seconds, and then he did something she had only seen him do once before, in her bakery, 3 months ago, when she had accidentally called him Dae instead of Daeseong, and then turned the color of her raspberry coulis. He laughed, really laughed, the kind of laugh that started in the belly and traveled upward, reshaping his entire face along the way, turning the sharp lines soft and the guarded eyes bright. It was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard, and it sealed something between them that neither of them fully understood yet. They were not yet in love, but they were standing at the edge of it, close enough to feel the warmth, and neither of them was stepping back. The months that followed were the happiest Selene had known since before she understood that happiness required defending. They fell into a rhythm that felt both impossible and inevitable, like a recipe that shouldn't work on paper but produced something extraordinary in practice. Mornings belonged to the bakery. Daeseong still came at 6:45, still ordered one of everything, still left $100 bill on the counter that Selene still pretended to argue about before accepting. But now there were additions to the routine. A thermos of Korean barley tea he brought her because he had noticed she drank too much coffee. A single stem of whatever flour Yunho had been dispatched to find that morning tucked between the pastry boxes, and a look exchanged across the counter that contained entire conversations neither of them needed to speak aloud. Evenings belonged to them. His warehouse or her apartment, tiny and smelling perpetually of yeast, which he claimed to prefer because it smelled like her. They cooked together more nights than not, his Korean dishes meeting her West African and French techniques in collisions that were sometimes disastrous and always educational. He taught her how to make kimchi, the proper way, elbow deep in chili paste, the recipe measured not in cups and teaspoons but in feel, in the memory of hands that were no longer there to guide his. They talked about everything and nothing. His childhood in Incheon, the cramped apartment above his father's first business, the sound of ships in the harbor at night. Her childhood in Baltimore, the smell of her mother's kitchen, the father who worked 3 jobs and still found time to read to her every night. He told her about the things he had done, not all of them, but enough. Enough to understand the shape of his world, the compromises that sustained it, the violence that enforced it. She listened without flinching, because she had made him a promise on a park bench. She would know the real him. In return, she told him about Kendrick. The full story this time, the 3 years of devotion poured into a man who had divided his affection like a budget. The discovery at a restaurant where she had gone to celebrate their anniversary, only to find him already there with someone else. The aftermath, the shame, the months of questioning her own judgment. The slow process of learning to trust herself again. Daesung listened to all of it with the stillness she had come to recognize as his deepest form of attention. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, very softly, "Tell me his full name." "Why?" "Because I want to know it." Daesung. "I'm not going to do anything. I just want to know the name of the man who was foolish enough to lose you." She told him, against her better judgment, and watched something settle behind his eyes. Not rage, but something quieter and more permanent. A filing away. A noting. "If I ever meet him," Daeshong said, "I will shake his hand." "You'll what?" "I will shake his hand and thank him. Because his stupidity is the reason you were standing on a sidewalk in Briarfield with a broken bag full of bread on the night I found you, and I will be grateful to him for that for the rest of my life." Selene had promised herself she wouldn't cry in front of him. She had promised herself a lot of things since meeting Dai Xiangquan, and she was breaking them one by one with a consistency that should have alarmed her, but instead felt like liberation. She cried. He held her. And somewhere in the warehouse, surrounded by the smell of bread and kimchi and the particular warmth that only exists between two people who have stopped pretending they aren't falling, the locked door inside Solen's chest opened for the first time in 4 years. He proposed on a rainy Wednesday, 7 months after the night he carried her bread. Not with a ring. That came later, a slim band of white gold that she wore on a chain around her neck, hidden beneath her chef's coat, because they both understood that what they had was too fragile and too precious to expose to the world he lived in. Not with a speech, either. Just 5 words, spoken into the darkness of his warehouse bedroom while rain hammered the roof and her head rested in the curve of his shoulder. Stay. Not tonight. Every night. She said yes with her whole body, pulling him closer, pressing her face against his neck, breathing him in, sandalwood and ginger and the faintest trace of chili paste from the kimchi they had made together that evening. And in the morning, she put on her flour-dusted clothes and went to work at Marigold as though nothing had changed, carrying a secret inside her chest that burned like a small, perfect sun. They married in secret 2 weeks later. A courthouse ceremony with Yun Ho as witness and a judge who understood that discretion was not optional. Solene wore a white sundress and her grandmother's earrings. Daisheng wore a suit that probably cost more than the courthouse itself. No one knew. Not Mrs. Oduya, who had progressed from unsolicited opinions to outright interrogations about the handsome man who visited every morning. Not Mr. Petrosian, who noticed everything and said nothing. Not Solen's mother in Baltimore, who called every Sunday and asked the same 3 questions. Are you eating? Are you sleeping? Have you met anyone? And Solen answered, yes, mostly, and no. The last word tasting like ash every time she said it. But the secret was necessary. His enemies were many, and a wife, a civilian wife, with no protection and no understanding of the wars fought daily in the shadows he inhabited, would be a target painted in neon on everything she touched. So Solene Mbire became Solene Quan in the eyes of the law and remained Solene Mbire in the eyes of the world. And for a while, that was enough. The call came at 3 in the morning on a night when Solen was alone in her apartment. They still maintained separate addresses, another layer of the fiction that protected them. And the sound of her phone vibrating against the nightstand dragged her out of a dreamless sleep with the efficiency of a defibrillator. Yun Ho's voice was the first thing she heard, and the controlled panic in it woke her more completely than any alarm could have. Mrs. Quan. He had never called her that before. In all the months she had known him, through all the carefully maintained boundaries of their strange arrangement, he had always called her Miss Mbire. The fact that he was using her married name now, in the middle of the night, told her everything she needed to know before he said another word. Where is he? Her voice came out steady, and some part of her marveled at that. At the calm that descended over her like a surgical drape, blocking out everything except what needed to be done. The warehouse. He's conscious, but... Yun Ho paused, and she heard something in that pause that frightened her more than anything he could have said. Yun Ho was a man who had been trained to withstand interrogation. If he was struggling to finish a sentence, the situation was catastrophic. I'm coming. She was already moving, pulling clothes over her pajamas, shoving her feet into shoes without bothering with socks. Her hands were shaking, but her mind was glass. Clear and sharp and dangerously focused. Tell me what happened. A meeting went wrong. The Huan group. They brought more men than agreed, and the negotiations collapsed. Another pause, shorter this time. He was stabbed. Twice. Once in the abdomen and once in the upper arm. The arm is superficial. The abdomen is not. Selene closed her eyes for 1 second, allowed herself to feel everything, then opened them and put it all away. Has he seen a doctor? He refuses to go to a hospital. The Juan group has connections in every emergency room in the city. If he walks into one, he walks into a trap. Then bring someone to him. We've been trying. Our usual physician is in Busan. The backup is unreachable. Yunho's voice dropped. Mrs. Kwan, he is asking for you. She made it to the warehouse in 14 minutes, running every red light. Yunho met her at the door, his shirt dark with blood that wasn't his hands trembling. Behind him, Taijun and Sang-woo stood in the hallway with expressions that belonged at a funeral. Where? She said, and Yunho led her to the kitchen. He was on the floor. Her husband was sitting on the kitchen floor with his back against the island where they had made kimchi together. His hand pressed against his abdomen, blood seeping through his fingers. He looked up when she entered, and the relief that flooded his face nearly broke her composure. You came, he said, and his voice was thin, reedy, nothing like the velvet authority she was used to. Of course I came, you impossible man. She was already on her knees beside him, pulling his hand away to assess the wound, checking his pulse. The bakery had taught her first aid. Burns, cuts, the occasional slip. But this was a knife wound requiring surgery, and she was a woman who made croissants for a living. I need to call an ambulance, she said, pulling out her phone. No. His hand closed over hers, bloody and firm. Selene, listen to me. You listen to me. She leaned close, her face inches from his, and spoke with a ferocity that silenced him mid-syllable. You married me. You stood in a courthouse and you promised me every night, and I am not going to let you die on our kitchen floor because you're too stubborn to go to a hospital. So either you give me another option, or I am calling 911, and your enemies, and your pride, and your entire empire can sort themselves out. The silence that followed was absolute. Taijun and Sang-woo, visible in the hallway, stared at her with expressions she would later describe as men witnessing a natural disaster they hadn't prepared for. Yunho, who had known Daeseong longer than anyone alive, looked at her with something that might have been awe. Daeseong held her gaze for 5 seconds that felt like 5 years. Then, there is a doctor. Off the books. Former military surgeon who operates a private practice under a different name. He owes me a debt large enough to guarantee his discretion. Call him. His name is Park Jae-min. His number is in my phone, under the name Butcher. It's a joke. He'll understand. Your sense of humor needs surgery more than you do. Selene found the phone, cracked screen, smeared with blood, and made the call. The man who answered spoke English with a Korean accent and a weariness that suggested being woken in the middle of the night by bleeding crime lords was not an entirely novel experience. How deep? Dr. Park asked. Deep enough that I can see things I shouldn't be seeing, Selene said, and she was proud of how clinical her voice sounded, as though she described abdominal stab wounds every day between batches of sourdough. Keep pressure on it. Elevate his legs. I'll be there in 30 minutes. The 30 minutes that followed were the longest of Selene's life. She held pressure on the wound with dish towels that had been white that morning and would never be white again, talking to Daeseong in a constant stream designed to keep him conscious. She told him about the croissant recipe she couldn't get right, about Mrs. Oduya's latest romance novel featuring a duke with an eye patch, about the time she set fire to her mother's kitchen making crème brûlée at 12, and her father asked if there was any left to eat. Once, his hand found hers beneath the bloody towels and squeezed, and she squeezed back so hard she felt his bones shift. If I die, he started. You are not dying. If I die. Daeseong Kwan, if you finish that sentence, I will stab you myself, and then you'll have 3 wounds to worry about instead of 2. A sound escaped him that might have been a laugh, or might have been a cough. Either way, it was wet and terrible, and it made her heart clench like a fist. "I love you," he said, and the words were so simple and so devastating that she had to bite the inside of her cheek hard enough to taste blood to keep from shattering. "I know," she said. "Tell me again when you're not bleeding on our floor." Dr. Park arrived in 27 minutes, a compact man in his 60s with steady hands and the bedside manner of a battlefield surgeon. He worked for 4 hours while Selene assisted, holding instruments, adjusting lights, following instructions in a calm, clipped cadence that reminded her of the best pastry chefs she had trained under. Precise, demanding, unwilling to accept anything less than perfection. When it was over, when the wounds were closed and Dae-seong was sleeping under surgical sedation, Selene sat on the kitchen floor surrounded by bloodied towels and let herself fall apart. She cried silently, her shoulders shaking, her hands pressed against her mouth to muffle the sound, because even now, even in the wreckage of the worst night of her life, she didn't want to wake him. Yunho found her there 20 minutes later. He didn't say anything. He simply sat down beside her on the bloody floor, his back against the island, his shoulder touching hers, and waited until the shaking stopped. It was the kindest thing anyone had ever done for her, and she would never forget it. Dr. Park returned the next morning and pronounced Dae-seong offensively healthy for someone who should be dead. Weeks of rest and monitoring, but he would survive. "Your wife saved his life," Dr. Park told Yunho in the hallway, not knowing Selene could hear from the kitchen. "Not the surgery, the 30 minutes before I arrived. If she had panicked, he would have bled out on that floor." Selene poured coffee and said nothing. Mrs. Oduya showed up at the bakery that afternoon with her tea, her romance novel, and her radar for emotional disturbance. Selene had dragged herself to work because the alternative was sitting in the warehouse watching Dae-seong breathe, and because the croissants wouldn't laminate themselves. "You look terrible," Mrs. Oduya announced, settling into her usual chair by the window with the directness of a woman who had spent 73 years on Earth and had decided, somewhere around year 40, that diplomacy was a waste of everyone's time. "Thank you, Mrs. Oduya. Can I get you anything? You can get me the truth about why you look like you haven't slept in 2 days, and why there's a scratch on your hand that you're trying to hide with flour." She fixed Selene with eyes that missed absolutely nothing. "And don't tell me it's the oven. I know what oven burns look like, and that's not one." Selene looked down at her hand, at the thin red line where Dae-seong's fingernail had scratched her when he grabbed her wrist, and felt something crack in the wall she had spent all morning building. "Mrs. Oduya, sit down. I have customers. You have Mr. Petrosian, who won't be here for another hour, and 2 pigeons on the windowsill who are not paying rent. Sit down, Selene." She sat. And then, because Mrs. Oduya had a way of creating silence that demanded filling, she talked. Not about the blood or the knife wounds, but about enough. About loving someone whose life operated by rules she didn't understand. About carrying a secret that grew heavier every day. About the fear that one day the phone would ring and Yunho's voice would say, "Mrs. Kwan," and the sentence that followed would end her world. Mrs. Oduya listened. When Selene finished, the older woman was quiet for a long moment. "My husband," she said finally, "was not a criminal. He was a civil servant in Lagos, a very boring man in very boring suits. But he kept secrets too. Different kinds, but secrets all the same. And I spent 31 years loving him while never being entirely sure I knew all of who he was." She looked at Selene with an expression that was equal parts warmth and steel. "You want me to tell you what to do, but you already know, don't you? The only question is whether you're brave enough to admit it." "What if being brave gets me killed?" Selene whispered. "Then you'll die knowing you lived honestly, which is more than most people manage." Mrs. Oduya reached across the table and took her hand, her grip surprisingly strong. The world will tell you that loving a dangerous man makes you foolish. Maybe it does. But I have read 412 romance novels, Solène, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that the greatest love stories are never about safe choices. They are about the ones who stayed when every sensible bone in their body told them to run. Solène looked at this woman she had known for 18 months and had somehow never seen clearly until this moment. This fierce, perceptive, quietly extraordinary woman who sat in her bakery window every day, reading about love and recognizing it in real time when it walked through the door. He asked me to stay, Solène said. Not tonight. Every night. Mrs. Oduya's face softened into a smile that held decades of understanding. And what did you say? I said yes. Then stop sitting here talking to an old woman and go be with your husband. She picked up her tea and her book, opened to the marked page and looked up once more. And bring him some chin-chin. In my experience, men heal faster when they're properly fed. Daeseong healed slowly, which infuriated him, and completely, which relieved everyone else. 6 weeks of enforced rest, during which Solène ran between the bakery and his bedside with tireless efficiency. By January, he was himself again, or close enough that only she could see the difference. A hand that drifted to his side when he thought no one was watching, a new depth in the way he looked at her, as though memorizing her face against the possibility that he might not always be there to see it. Life resumed its rhythm. The bakery thrived. Marigold had developed a following that extended well beyond Briarfield, food bloggers and weekend tourists joining the construction workers and Mr. Petrosian in lines that sometimes stretched to the corner. Daeseong watched her success with a pride he made no effort to disguise, and Solène caught him once reading online reviews of her pastries with an expression usually reserved for quarterly earnings reports. It was in this fragile, reconstructed piece that the past decided to reintroduce itself. The Briarfield Community Market happened every spring, a street fair that shut down Voss Street for a Saturday and brought the entire neighborhood together. Solène had a booth this year, her first, showcasing Marigold's full range. Daeseong had wanted to come, but a business matter had called him away that morning, and he had left with a promise to return by noon. The booth was busy. Solène was in her element, boxing pastries and answering questions and accepting compliments with the awkward grace of someone who still wasn't entirely comfortable being praised. The sun was warm for April, the street was full of people, and for a few hours, she felt something close to uncomplicated happiness. She was handing a box of chin-chin to a customer when she heard the voice. A voice she hadn't heard in over 4 years, but that her nervous system recognized before her brain did, sending a jolt of ice water through her veins that made her fingers go numb around the pastry box. Well, Solène Mbire. Kendrick Ayoade was standing in front of her booth with a smile that hadn't changed. Still wide, still practiced, still designed to make you feel like you were the only person in the room, even when you knew for a fact that you weren't. He was wearing clothes that were slightly too expensive for a community market, his arm draped around a woman Solène didn't recognize, and his posture radiated the particular confidence of a man who believed the universe had been specifically designed for his comfort. Kendrick, Solène said, and her voice came out flat as a blade laid sideways. No tremor, no crack, nothing he could use. It's been a while. 4 years. He leaned against the booth like he owned it, his eyes sliding over her setup with undisguised condescension. Heard you opened a little bakery out here. That's sweet. The word dripped with patronizing affection that made Seleni's jaw tighten. Still doing the whole independent woman thing, huh? It's not a thing, Kendrick. It's my life. Right. He nodded, performing understanding in the way he performed everything. Convincingly enough on the surface, hollow underneath. His eyes flicked to her left hand, bare of any ring, and his smile widened into something that made her stomach turn. And still single, I see. What's it been now? 4 years? 5? Must be tough out here on your own. I always said you needed someone to. To what? Selene cut in, her voice quiet but edged with something that made the customer beside her take a small step back. To lie to me? To build a relationship on deception, and then act surprised when it collapsed? Please, Kendrick, finish that sentence. I'd love to hear what you think I need. A small crowd had begun to gather. Kendrick thrived in crowds. He always had. He straightened, feeding on the audience. I'm just saying, Selene, it's been a long time. At some point you gotta ask yourself if maybe the problem isn't the men. Maybe it's you. He squeezed the woman beside him, who had the expression of someone who had agreed to a pleasant Saturday outing and was now reconsidering several life choices. Some of us have moved on, found happiness, built something real. He paused, timing the next words with the precision of a man who knew exactly how much damage they could do. Still single, Solo? That's what I used to call her. He added to the crowd with a wink that made Selene's vision narrow. Solo, because she's always, always alone. The silence that followed was the kind that has texture, thick and weighted and full of held breaths. Selene felt it pressing against her skin, felt the eyes of strangers cataloging her reaction, felt the old shame rising in her throat like bile. And then, from behind her, a voice. She's not alone. Daeshang materialized at her side. He was wearing a simple dark jacket over a white shirt, and to anyone who didn't know better, he looked like a perfectly ordinary man at a street fair. But Selene saw the shift. The subtle squaring of shoulders, the stillness of a predator going quiet, and recognized controlled fury wrapped in absolute calm. He placed his hand on the small of her back, and the touch was light, almost casual, but Selene felt the warmth of it radiate through her entire body like a current being switched on. I'm sorry, Kendrick said, his smile faltering for the first time as he took in the man standing beside Selene. And you are? Her husband, Daeseong said. The two words landed like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples through the crowd that Selene could almost see. Kendrick's smile collapsed. The woman on his arm stiffened. Two people in the crowd exchanged glances. And behind Daeseong, visible only to Selene because she knew where to look, Yun-ho stepped out of the crowd and positioned himself with the casual precision of a man who had spent his career being exactly where he needed to be at exactly the right moment. Selene raised her left hand and pulled the chain from beneath her chef's coat. The white gold band caught the April sunlight and threw it back in a flash that seemed, in that moment, almost theatrical. Selene Kwan, she said, and her voice carried across the gathered crowd with a clarity that surprised even her. 9 months now, but thank you for your concern about my love life, Kendrick. It's touching, really. Kendrick's face underwent a series of transformations Selene would replay for years. Confusion, disbelief, then a rapid recalculation as his eyes moved from Selene to Daeseong to the ring and back, trying to construct a version of reality that preserved his narrative. He couldn't find one. You're married, he said, as though repeating it might make it less true. Happily, Selene confirmed. Very, Daeseong added, and his voice held a warmth that was entirely for Selene and a warning that was entirely for Kendrick, both occupying the same word with a precision that would have impressed a linguist. Kendrick opened his mouth, closed it, and opened it again. He looked like a man who had walked into what he thought was a puddle and discovered it was an ocean. Congratulations, that's great. Really great. It is, Daeseong agreed pleasantly. He leaned slightly forward, and what he said next was pitched low enough that only Kendrick and Selene could hear it. A piece of advice, Mr. Iowad. The next time you feel the urge to humiliate a woman in public to make yourself feel significant, consider the possibility that you don't know everything about her life. and consider carefully whether the things you don't know might be the kind of things that are better left undiscovered. It wasn't a threat. Not exactly, but it occupied the same space a threat would have occupied. Kendrick's face drained of color and he took a step back that he tried to make look casual and failed. Right. Well, congratulations. He turned and walked away with the urgent nonchalance of a man who has just realized he is in significantly more danger than he had anticipated. The woman on his arm followed, her expression suggesting that several uncomfortable conversations were imminent. The crowd dispersed, and Selene turned to Daeseong with bright eyes. "You heard all of that?" she asked. "I heard enough." His hand was still on her back, steady and warm. "I arrived when he called you solo." Yunho had to physically restrain himself, which I mention only so you understand the depth of feeling my staff has developed for you. Selene laughed, a real laugh, wet and shaky and full of relief, and pressed her face against his shoulder in full view of anyone who cared to watch. She didn't care. Let them see. Let the whole neighborhood see. She was done hiding, done carrying the weight of a secret that had been designed to protect her, but had also, she realized now, been keeping her small. "I love you," she said into his jacket. "I know," he replied, and then, quieter. "I believe you still have customers." She pulled back, wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and turned to find a line of people at her booth that stretched halfway down the block. Some drawn by the pastries, some drawn by the spectacle, all of them about to receive the best service Selene Kwan had ever delivered, because she was running on adrenaline and love and the particular high that comes from watching Karma arrive in real time, wearing a dark jacket and speaking in a voice like smoke wrapped around a blade. That night, in the warehouse, Daeseong told her everything: the Hwan group, the escalating tensions. They knew about her now. The market today. The ring flashing in sunlight, photographed and uploaded by strangers, meant that by morning, every organization with an interest in Daeseong Kwan's vulnerabilities would know he had a wife. "I've been thinking about this since the night I was stabbed," he said. They were sitting on the kitchen floor, their floor, the one that had been cleaned but never fully returned to what it was before, marked by stains that no amount of scrubbing could fully erase. "About what matters, about what I'm willing to lose." Selene waited, her back against the island, her shoulder touching his. "I built this empire because my father told me it was my destiny. Because his father told him the same thing. Because the men in my family have been climbing this particular mountain for 3 generations, and stopping felt like betrayal." He turned to look at her, and his eyes held something she had seen only twice before: the night he proposed, and the night he nearly died. Raw, unfiltered honesty. "But I climbed high enough to see the view, Selene, and the view is just more mountain. There is no top. There is only the next battle, the next enemy, the next night when someone I love sits on a kitchen floor holding my wounds closed with dish towels." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I want to stop climbing." He took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers the way they had learned to fit together, instinctively, without adjustment, like a design finalized long before they met. "Yunho has been preparing an exit strategy for months, legitimate businesses separated from the rest, clean enough to build on, enough money to live without the empire, a life that doesn't require you to hide your ring or lie to your mother." "You would do that?" Selene asked, and her voice cracked on the last word. "Walk away from everything your family built?" "My family built a cage," Daeseong said quietly. "A beautiful cage, but a cage. My mother knew that. It's why she taught me to cook, so I would know there was more to life than what my father showed me. And you," he lifted her hand to his lips, "you showed me what the more could look like. Bread and chin-chin and Sunday mornings and a woman who threatened to stab me while I was bleeding on our floor. That is the only empire worth building." Selene was crying now, tears running freely, and she made no effort to stop them. She had spent so long being strong. But this man willing to dismantle everything he was so they could build something new, broke through every defense she had. "It won't be easy," she said. "Starting over." "No. People will come looking for you." "Yes. And we'll need a bigger kitchen." Daisong looked at her, and the smile that broke across his face was not the ghost, not the almost, not the carefully controlled fraction she had spent a year learning to spot. It was the full thing, complete and unguarded, and so bright it seemed to change the temperature of the room. "I know a good baker," he said. "She makes extraordinary chin-chin." Solène leaned her head against his shoulder, the same shoulder where, metaphorically if not literally, this whole story had begun, and breathed in the smell of sandalwood and ginger and home. "Call your mother first," she said, "and then call mine. She's going to be furious that we got married without telling her, and I'd rather you handle that particular explosion while I still have plausible deniability." "You want me to tell your mother?" "Consider it your first act as a civilian. I survived 3 assassination attempts and a stabbing. None of which prepared you for Vivienne Mbire on the phone when she finds out her daughter got married in a courthouse without inviting her. Trust me." Daishang Quan, who had dismantled criminal empires and convinced the abyss to blink first, picked up his phone with the careful resignation of a man about to face the most formidable opponent of his career. And Solène sat beside him, flower still on her wrists, a ring on a chain around her neck that she would never hide again, and smiled. Some stories end with a sunset. Theirs ended with a phone call, a mother's scream that could be heard from 3 rooms away, and the sound of 2 people laughing so hard they couldn't breathe. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't safe, but it was theirs. And it was more than enough.